On the morning of March 12, 2018, in the peaceful Jackson, Mississippi neighborhood, Deaconess Lorraine Johnson arrived at the home of Pastor Elijah Thornton, as she regularly did. Lorraine, a loyal member of the Greater Faith Baptist Church, where Pastor Elijah had served for over 10 years, was a trusted and reliable figure in the church community. At 55 years old, Lorraine often assisted the pastor with his daily tasks, and that Monday morning was expected to be no different. However, as Lorraine approached the modest two-story brick house on Pinehurst Street, she noticed something unusual. The front door was ajar, a sight out of character for Pastor Elijah, known for his punctuality and organization. Concerned, Lorraine approached the door cautiously and called out, "Pastor Elijah?" but received no answer. Uncertain but increasingly uneasy, she pushed the door open and stepped inside, immediately noticing the eerie silence of the house, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. As she moved further into the home, Lorraine's heart raced. The atmosphere was thick with an unsettling sense that something was terribly wrong. The living room was in chaos. Furniture was overturned, papers were scattered, and a lamp had been knocked over. This disarray sharply contrasted with the usually neat and orderly home. Lorraine's breath caught in her throat when she entered the hallway, leading to Pastor Elijah's study. The door was partially open, and as she peered inside, she saw him. Pastor Elijah Thornton was lying motionless on the floor, his body contorted unnaturally, and his white shirt soaked in blood. Lorraine gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she staggered back, nearly losing her balance. Overcome by the need to flee, she fumbled for her phone and dialed 911, her fingers trembling as she spoke. "Help, please help," she stammered. When the dispatcher answered, she urgently said, "It's Pastor Thornton. He's dead. He's been murdered." The words felt foreign and surreal as they left her mouth. The dispatcher calmly instructed her to stay on the line and remain outside the house until police arrived. Moments later, the wail of sirens pierced the air as officers from the Jackson Police Department arrived at the scene. They quickly secured the area, and Detective Samuel Hayes, the lead investigator, was one of the first to enter the house. At 38 years old, Hayes was an experienced detective, known for his meticulous approach to even the most challenging cases. He was immediately struck by the brutality of the crime. Pastor Elijah's body showed multiple stab wounds, and the bloodshed indicated a violent struggle. The detective scanned the room with a practiced eye, noting signs that suggested a break-in or a violent altercation. However, nothing of significant value appeared to be missing, which raised doubts about the possibility of a robbery gone awry. After giving Lorraine some time to collect herself, Hayes approached her for an initial statement. "I know this is hard, but I need to ask you a few questions," Hayes said gently. Lorraine nodded, her voice trembling as she recalled the morning's events. "I came to check on Pastor Elijah like I do every Monday. The door was open, and then I found him. I've never seen anything like this. Who would do such a thing?" Detective Hayes knew solving this case would require understanding the various layers of Pastor Elijah's life, both public and private. He needed to uncover who Pastor Elijah truly was, and who might have had enough motive to carry out such a brutal act. Detective Hayes approached the investigation with a clear plan. Gather information from those closest to the pastor, piece together a timeline, and uncover possible motives. His first priority was to explore Pastor Elijah's life behind the scenes, focusing on his relationships within the church and the community, beginning with Lorraine Johnson. Hayes conducted a thorough follow-up interview at the police station, where Lorraine spoke about her long history with the pastor, describing him as a man deeply committed to his ministry. When asked about any changes in Pastor Elijah's behavior or potential conflicts, Lorraine hesitated before mentioning rumors she had heard. Some church members had been discussing Pastor Elijah's close relationship with a young man named Malik Johnson, though she dismissed it as mere gossip. However, Hayes noticed the discomfort in her voice, prompting him to pursue this lead further. In the following days, Hayes interviewed several members of Greater Faith Baptist Church. Many spoke highly of Pastor Elijah, describing him as a charismatic and deeply involved leader. Yet, as Hayes delved deeper, a recurring theme emerged. Some members felt uneasy about the time Pastor Elijah spent with Malik Johnson, an 18-year-old churchgoer. While most people hesitated to speak negatively, there was a persistent undercurrent of suspicion. One of the most revealing interviews came from Reverend Charles Bowman, an assistant pastor, who mentioned that in the past year, Pastor Elijah had become more withdrawn and secretive. He also pointed out the unusual amount of time the pastor spent with Malik, which had raised concerns among the church leadership, though no one had dared confront the pastor directly. Bowman's account reinforced the rumors Hayes had already encountered. With this new information, Hayes decided to speak to Malik Johnson directly. On the morning of March 15th, he visited the Davis household, where Malik lived with his parents, Tyrone and Angela Davis. The family was known in the community for their strong faith, with Tyrone particularly active in church activities. Malik, a quiet and reserved young man, seemed nervous when he met with the detective. Malik had always felt different, growing up in the tight-knit Jackson community, where there were clear expectations, especially for someone raised in a devout household. At 18, Malik was struggling with his identity, torn between the person he was expected to be and the person he truly was. This inner conflict became more intense when he crossed paths with Pastor Elijah Thornton, the man who would change his life in ways he had never imagined. Malik had attended Greater Faith Baptist Church since childhood. His father, Tyrone, was a strict and devout man who demanded unwavering commitment to faith and family. His mother, Angela, was nurturing, but also bound by the same traditions. Pastor Elijah, however, seemed to understand Malik in a way no one else did. The pastor listened without judgment as Malik shared his doubts, fears, and eventually his attraction to men, feelings that conflicted with everything he had been taught. Rather than condemning him, Pastor Elijah offered comfort, reassuring Malik that he was not alone in his struggles. It was a connection Malik had longed for, a place where he could be himself without fear of rejection. What began as spiritual guidance soon turned into something more intimate. The boundaries between mentor and confidant blurred, and before long, Malik and Pastor Elijah were involved in a secret romantic relationship. For Malik, this affair was a source of comfort and acceptance, things he had always sought but could never find. Yet their relationship was fraught with tension and fear. Both Malik and Pastor Elijah knew the severe consequences if their secret were ever discovered in the conservative and religious community they lived in. Such a revelation would result in scandal, ostracism, and, for Pastor Elijah, the end of his career and reputation. For Malik, it would mean the loss of his family and the life he had always known. This constant fear took a toll on Malik, who, despite finding solace in their secret meetings, lived in constant anxiety, always fearing someone would discover the truth. The guilt weighed heavily on him, especially when he sat in church, surrounded by people who looked up to Pastor Elijah as a moral and spiritual guide. As Malik became more withdrawn, avoiding friends and family who noticed changes in his behavior, his mother, Angela, often asked if everything was okay. Malik would always reply with a forced smile and a quick reassurance. The pressure from his father, Tyrone, only added to his distress. Tyrone's strong convictions and clear expectations for Malik to follow the faith, live righteously, and eventually marry a good Christian woman, left Malik feeling trapped between his father's rigid beliefs and his own growing reality, which was becoming increasingly difficult to reconcile. As the one-year mark of his relationship with Pastor Elijah approached, the strain became unbearable, and Malik began to question everything. Malik began to question whether this was the life he truly wanted, a life filled with secrets, lies, and the constant fear of being discovered. He also began to notice changes in Pastor Elijah. The once confident and assured pastor now seemed anxious and distracted, as if the weight of their hidden relationship was starting to take its toll on him as well. Malik's emotions shifted between love and fear, dependence and guilt, leaving him feeling more isolated than ever. It was during this fragile state that he found himself grappling with the news of Pastor Elijah's murder on the morning of March 12, 2018. The shock and horror of hearing the news left Malik reeling. The man who had been his confidant, lover, and guide was suddenly gone, violently taken from him. In the days that followed, Malik struggled to cope with his grief while also dealing with the overwhelming fear that their secret might be exposed during the investigation. As he sat alone in his room, the weight of the situation pressed down on him, and he began to wonder if he would ever escape the shadows of the life he had lived for the past year. Angela Davis, Malik's mother, was an astute woman with an instinct for noticing when something was wrong. Over the past few months, she had seen Malik's anxious glances, his reluctance to speak about his time at church, and how he often seemed lost in thought. The more she observed him, the more convinced she became that something was deeply wrong. One evening, after another quiet dinner, Malik retreated to his room. Angela, determined to find answers, decided to act. She waited until Malik was in the shower before quietly entering his room. She didn't want to invade his privacy, but her motherly instincts told her this was necessary. On his desk, she noticed his phone, left unlocked. Hesitant yet resolute, Angela picked it up and began scrolling through his messages. What she found confirmed her worst fears: explicit and intimate messages between Malik and Pastor Elijah, revealing a secret relationship that had lasted for months. A wave of shock and horror washed over Angela as she read through the messages. The reality of what her son had been hiding hit her like a physical blow. The pastor, a man she had trusted and respected, was involved with her teenage son. Her mind raced with questions, emotions of anger, betrayal, and fear for Malik's well-being. Unable to keep this discovery to herself, Angela waited for Malik to return to his room, and when he did, she confronted him, holding the phone as evidence. Malik's face turned pale as he realized what she had found. Tears welled up in his eyes, and he began to cry. The weight of the secret finally overwhelmed him. Between sobs, he confessed everything to his mother: how it had started, how it had developed, and the conflicting emotions he had felt throughout the relationship. Angela listened, her heart breaking for her son. She could see the pain and confusion in his eyes, the guilt and fear that had been eating away at him. Later that night, Angela knew she had to tell Tyrone, Malik's father. She dreaded his reaction, knowing how deeply he respected Pastor Elijah and how rigid his views were. But keeping the secret any longer wasn't an option. She found Tyrone in the living room, watching television. With a heavy heart, she turned off the TV and sat beside him, her hands trembling. "Tyrone, we need to talk," she began, her voice barely a whisper. She explained what she had discovered, showing him the messages on Malik's phone. As she spoke, Tyrone's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, and then to simmering rage. He stood up suddenly, pacing the room as he tried to process the information. "How could he? How could Elijah do this?" Tyrone shouted, his voice shaking with anger. "He was supposed to be a man of God, a mentor to our son." Malik, hearing the commotion, came downstairs. The sight of his father's fury terrified him. Tyrone turned to his son, struggling to control his emotions. "Why didn't you tell us?" he demanded, his voice breaking. Malik could only sob, his guilt and fear leaving him unable to speak. Tyrone's anger simmered, his mind racing with thoughts of confronting Pastor Elijah. Angela, on the other hand, focused on supporting Malik, trying to help him through the emotional turmoil. She also worried about the potential fallout if the truth were to become public, not just for their family but for the entire church community. The discovery of Malik's relationship with Pastor Elijah had shattered the Davis family. The trust they had placed in the pastor was gone, replaced by a deep sense of betrayal and anger. Tyrone couldn't sleep. The revelation about his son's secret relationship with Pastor Elijah had shattered his world. The betrayal by a man he had respected, admired, and trusted with his family was a wound too deep to heal. The idea of his son being involved with another man, especially one who was supposed to be a spiritual leader, was something Tyrone could neither understand nor accept. The more he thought about it, the more his rage grew. By the early hours of the morning, Tyrone had made up his mind. He could not let this injustice stand. Pastor Elijah had taken advantage of his son, and for that, he had to pay. He dressed quickly, slipped out of the house, and set his mind on confronting the man who had destroyed his family's peace. The drive to Pastor Elijah's home was a blur. Tyrone's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white with tension. His mind raced with images of Malik, his son, raised with strict moral values, led astray by someone who should have known better. When Tyrone arrived at Pastor Elijah's house, it was still dark. The early morning hours were quiet and still. He parked his car a short distance away and approached the house on foot, his steps heavy with purpose. The house was silent, the lights dim, unaware of the storm that was about to break. Tyrone hesitated for a moment at the front door, briefly considering the consequences of what he was about to do. But the image of Malik's tear-streaked face, his son's anguish and shame, pushed all doubt aside. Tyrone knocked on the door, hard and insistent. It wasn't long before movement came from inside. A few moments later, the door opened, and Pastor Elijah stood before him, clearly surprised to see Tyrone at such an early hour. The pastor was dressed casually, clearly not expecting visitors. "Tyrone," Pastor Elijah began, his voice calm but wary. "What brings you here so early?" Tyrone's response was immediate and furious. "You know damn well why I'm here." Pastor Elijah's expression shifted, a mix of shock and guilt crossing his face. He took a step back, sensing the danger in Tyrone's eyes. "Tyrone, please, let's talk about this," Pastor Elijah pleaded. But Tyrone was beyond talking. The rage that had been building inside him for days exploded in that moment. He pushed his way into the house, his larger frame easily overpowering the pastor. Elijah stumbled back, trying to keep his balance, but Tyrone was relentless. The door slammed shut behind them as Tyrone advanced on Pastor Elijah, his eyes filled with fury. "What did you think was going to happen?" Tyrone shouted, his voice echoing through the quiet house. "Did you think you could just do whatever you wanted and there'd be no consequences? You twisted my son's mind, you took advantage of him, and you call yourself a man of God." Pastor Elijah raised his hands in a pleading gesture, trying to reason with Tyrone. "Tyrone, I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt anyone." But Tyrone wasn't listening. The apology only fueled his anger further. He lunged at the pastor, grabbing him by the collar and shoving him against the wall. Pastor Elijah struggled, trying to push Tyrone away, but he was no match for the older man's strength. In his rage, Tyrone's fists became weapons, raining down blows on Pastor Elijah with a force driven by months of pent-up frustration and pain. Finally, in an uncontrollable act of rage, Tyrone grabbed a heavy object from a nearby table, a solid brass candlestick. He raised it high and brought it down on Pastor Elijah's head with all his might. The pastor crumpled to the floor, blood pouring from the wound. Tyrone stood over him, breathing heavily, his hands shaking from the exertion and shock of what he had just done. The room was silent, the only sound the ragged breathing of Tyrone as he stared down at the lifeless body of Pastor Elijah Thornton. The reality of his actions slowly began to sink in, and the weight of what he had done crashed down on him. The rage that had driven him was gone. A cold, numbing horror replaced Tyrone's initial fury as he stared at the scene before him. The reality of what had just happened settled in as he looked around the room, almost as if he were seeing it for the first time. Pastor Elijah, the man who had once been a trusted pillar of the community, lay dead at his feet, killed by his own hand. Tyrone couldn't say how long he stood there, transfixed by the sight, before he turned and fled the house. He didn't bother closing the door behind him as he stumbled out into the pre-dawn darkness. Detective Samuel Hayes, known for his meticulous investigative methods, was assigned to lead the case from the beginning. Hayes understood that this case would be far from ordinary. Forensic teams carefully examined the murder scene at Pastor Elijah's house, with blood spatter analysis, the position of the body, and the presence of a blood-stained brass candlestick, all pointing to a crime driven by intense personal emotions. The violence suggested deep-seated animosity. Intrigued, Hayes pursued this line of investigation with renewed urgency and called Malik Davis in for questioning, hoping to gather more information. Malik, still shaken by the recent events and the turmoil in his family, was visibly nervous during the interview. His reluctance to discuss Pastor Elijah only fueled Hayes's suspicions. The detective knew there was more to the story than Malik was willing to reveal. As Hayes dug deeper, he also focused on Malik's parents, Tyrone and Angela Davis. Early reports painted them as a tight-knit religious family with strong connections to the church. However, when Hayes questioned Angela, he noticed her discomfort whenever Pastor Elijah was brought up. She seemed protective of Malik, but there was a tension she couldn't hide. A neighbor who had been out late on the night of the murder reported seeing Tyrone's car near Pastor Elijah's house. This sighting, although brief, placed Tyrone at the scene during the critical time frame. With this new lead, Hayes began assembling a timeline. He reviewed phone records that showed Tyrone made no calls during the hours surrounding the murder, a silence that seemed suspicious. The detective also learned that Tyrone had left his home that night without informing his wife, an odd behavior for someone known to be routine-oriented and predictable. Forensic evidence soon provided the final pieces of the puzzle. Lab results confirmed that Tyrone's fingerprints were found on the murder weapon, the brass candlestick, which was covered in blood. Traces of Pastor Elijah's blood were also found on Tyrone's clothing, which had been hastily washed, but not thoroughly enough to remove all traces of evidence. With mounting evidence, Hayes knew it was time to bring Tyrone in for questioning. When the police arrived at the Davis household, Tyrone did not resist. His demeanor was calm, almost resigned, as though he had already accepted his fate. During the interrogation, Tyrone initially remained silent, his face a mask of stoic determination. Hayes pressed him about his whereabouts the night of the murder, his relationship with Pastor Elijah, and the evidence linking him to the crime. It wasn't until Hayes mentioned Malik and the emotional toll the situation was taking on his son that Tyrone finally spoke. In a voice heavy with emotion, Tyrone confessed to confronting Pastor Elijah. He spoke of the betrayal he felt upon discovering the relationship between the pastor and his son, and how that revelation consumed him with anger and righteous indignation. With Tyrone's confession and the overwhelming forensic evidence, the case against him was solid. Despite being satisfied with the resolution of the case, Detective Hayes couldn't shake the sadness that lingered over the investigation. As legal proceedings began, the town of Jackson found itself divided. The once respected Tyrone Davis was now at the center of a high-profile murder trial, and Pastor Elijah was remembered not only for his sermons, but also for the scandal that emerged after his death. The trial began in the Jackson County Courthouse, and the courtroom was filled with spectators and media eager to follow the unfolding drama. The case captured the public's attention, partly because of the sensational nature of the crime and the involvement of a respected pastor, and partly due to the shocking revelation of Pastor Elijah's secret relationship with Malik. Tyrone's defense team, led by a skilled attorney, worked tirelessly to shape their client's narrative. They argued that Tyrone had been driven to the brink of insanity upon discovering his son's relationship with Pastor Elijah. They claimed that the pastor had manipulated Malik, and by extension Tyrone, pushing him into emotional and psychological turmoil. Their defense hinged on the idea that Tyrone's actions were not premeditated, but were the result of a momentary lapse caused by overwhelming rage and betrayal. The testimonies during the trial were deeply affecting. Malik Davis took the stand, his presence a poignant reminder of the personal tragedy at the heart of the case. He spoke haltingly about his relationship with Pastor Elijah, his feelings of betrayal, and the devastating impact of the murder on his family. The courtroom fell silent as Malik recounted the emotional and psychological turmoil he had endured. His testimony painted a picture of a young man torn between his love for the pastor and the horror of his father's actions. His tearful recounting garnered public sympathy for his plight. Tyrone himself also took the stand in his defense. His testimony was a mix of defiance and remorse. He spoke about his shock and rage upon discovering the relationship between his son and Pastor Elijah, describing the confrontation and the overwhelming emotions that led to the pastor's death. While he expressed some remorse, his tone remained defiant, reflecting his belief that his actions were justified under the circumstances. After several weeks of intense proceedings, the verdict was delivered. Tyrone Davis was found guilty of first-degree murder. The verdict was met with a mixture of relief and sadness. While the jury's decision was seen as a necessary step toward justice, it did little to heal the deep wounds left by the crime. Tyrone was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.